My mother died on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks before my 8th grade finals. I remember that detail because I was supposed to turn in a biology project that day. Something about cellular respiration that I'd barely started. Instead, I was standing in a hospital corridor that smelled like bleached floors and recycled air, listening to a doctor whose name I've forgotten tell me that the cancer had reached her brain, her lungs, her bones, and that we were now in what he called comfort care. I was 14 years old, and I didn't know what comfort care meant until I watched my mother stop being my mother and become something else, something small and confused and in pain. My name is Nolan Kepler, and this is the story of how I learned that cruelty doesn't always look like cruelty, how silence can be a weapon, and how the boy who falls asleep in class might be fighting a war you know nothing about. Before my mother got sick, I was ordinary in the best possible way. I played pickup basketball badly at the courts behind Riverside Middle School, collected comic books that I kept in pristine plastic sleeves, and argued with my friends about whether Jordan or LeBron was better, even though we were all too young to have watched Jordan play live. I got B's and occasional A's, forgot my homework sometimes, and generally moved through life in Western Massachusetts like most kids do, unnoticed, unconcerned, unaware that everything could change in the time it takes for a doctor to say the word metastatic. My father had left when I was 6. I have exactly 3 memories of him. The smell of motor oil on his hands when he'd ruffle my hair after coming home from the garage where he worked. The sound of him yelling at a Patriots game on our small television. And the morning I woke up to find my mother crying at the kitchen table, telling me that Daddy had gone to live somewhere else and wouldn't be coming back. She never spoke badly about him. She never explained what happened. She never answered my questions about whether he'd visit or call. She just worked 2 jobs. Day shift at a medical billing office downtown, evening shift doing bookkeeping for a small accounting firm, and made sure I had everything I needed. We lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building near the school. The place had thin walls, a radiator that clanked and hissed almost during the winter, and the kitchen so small that only one person could stand in it comfortably. My mother kept it obsessively clean. She'd come home at 9:30 at night, exhausted from her second job, smelling like coffee and printer toner, and she'd still wipe down the kitchen counters, still make sure my school clothes were laid out for the next day, still check my homework folder even though I was old enough to manage it myself. I didn't appreciate it then. I didn't understand that she was building a life out of almost nothing, that every small act of order was an act of defiance against chaos. I didn't understand that she was terrified of failing me, terrified of not being enough, terrified that one mistake would send our fragile life tumbling down. I just thought she was my mom, and moms did things like that. The cancer was breast cancer initially. She found it herself, a lump she felt in the shower one morning. By the time she went to a doctor, she'd waited 4 months because we didn't have good insurance, and she was terrified of the cost. It had already spread to her lymph nodes. I didn't know any of this at first. She hid it from me for weeks, maybe months. She'd disappear for appointments that she said were for work. She'd come home looking gray and exhausted and tell me she just needed to rest. I found out by accident. I came home early from school one day in October. It was a half day for parent-teacher conferences, and found her on the bathroom floor, vomiting into the toilet, a prescription bottle on the sink labeled with words I didn't understand. Ondansetron, metoclopramide. She looked up at me with mascara running down her face, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Fear. Not fear of the cancer, fear that I'd seen her weak. "I'm okay, baby," she said, which is what parents say when they're not okay and don't know what else to offer. That night, she sat me down at our small kitchen table and told me she had cancer. She explained it calmly, rationally, like she was describing someone else's problem. She was getting treatment. The doctors were optimistic. She'd have to do chemotherapy, which would make her tired and sick for a while, but then she'd get better. Everything would be fine. She was lying, and I think we both knew it. But I was 13, and I wanted to believe her. That was October of 8th grade. By November, she couldn't work anymore. The chemotherapy was brutal. She'd spend 3 days after each treatment unable to keep food down, unable to do anything, except lie in bed and try not to move too much. Her hair fell out in clumps. She bought a wig, but rarely wore it at home. By December, she was in the hospital more than she was in our apartment. The hospital was St. Mary's Medical Center, a large facility across town that served the whole region. It was a 40-minute bus ride from our apartment. 2 buses, actually, with a transfer downtown. My mother had been admitted to the oncology ward on the 4th floor, a place that tried very hard to seem cheerful and mostly failed. The walls were painted a pale yellow that was supposed to be sunny but just looked jaundiced. There were motivational posters about hope and strength. There was a small lounge area with magazines that were 6 months old and a television that only got basic cable. My mother's room was a double, but her roommate changed frequently. Cancer patients either got better and went home, or they got worse and went somewhere else. I learned not to get attached to the people in the other bed. By January, the hospital had become my second home. I'd go to school, sit through classes in the fog of exhaustion, then take the buses to St. Mary's and stay until visiting hours ended at 10 p.m. Then I'd take the buses home, get to our apartment around 11, try to sleep for a few hours, and do it all again the next day. The social worker at the hospital, a kind woman in her 50s named April Talley, noticed what was happening. She pulled me aside one evening in early January and asked if I was doing okay, if there was family who could help, if the school knew about my situation. "I'm fine," I told her, because that's what I'd been taught to say. "My aunt checks on me." This was technically true. My mother's sister Lucinda lived in Connecticut and called once a week to ask how my mother was doing. She'd visited twice since the diagnosis, brief, uncomfortable visits where she'd sit in my mother's hospital room, looking overwhelmed and then leave, after 20 minutes, promising to come back soon. April looked at me like she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. I think she had a dozen other families to worry about, other kids in worse situations. I was attending school, I wasn't causing problems, I had a place to live. That made me lucky, relatively speaking, so I kept going, kept riding the buses, kept sitting in that pale yellow hospital room, doing homework on a tray table while my mother slept, or stared at the television without really watching it. The chemotherapy wasn't working. I knew this before the doctors officially said it, because I could see my mother getting worse. She was losing weight rapidly, her face became gaunt, her collarbones jutted out sharply, her wedding ring slid off her finger one day, and she didn't have the strength to pick it up. I retrieved it from the floor and put it on her bedside table, and she looked at it with an expression I couldn't read. The doctors tried a different chemotherapy protocol, then another. Each one made her sicker without making her better. By February, they were talking about palliative care. I didn't know what that meant, so I looked it up in the hospital library. Care focused on comfort rather than cure. Care for when there's nothing left to try. I was sitting in Mr. Victor Granger's 8th grade English class when I realized my mother was going to die. We were reading The Crucible by Arthur Miller, discussing themes of integrity and moral courage. Mr. Granger was lecturing about John Proctor's final choice to die rather than sign a false confession. He was animated, passionate, pacing at the front of the room the way he did when he was really into the material. Proctor chooses death over dishonor, Mr. Granger said, his gravelly voice filling the classroom. He understands that some things are more important than survival: his name, his integrity, his sense of self. These matter more than life itself. And I sat there, thinking, my mother is going to die, and there's nothing noble about it. She's not choosing anything. Cancer is taking her piece by piece, and all her integrity and strength and love for me can't stop it. I must have made some sound, a gasp or a sob, I don't know, because Mr. Granger stopped talking and looked at me. Mr. Kepler, he said, do you have something to contribute to the discussion? No, sir, I managed. Sorry. Then please pay attention. I paid attention. I sat there for the remaining 30 minutes of class, staring at the words in my copy of The Crucible, not seeing them, thinking about my mother in the hospital bed, wondering how much time I had left. That night, I stayed at the hospital until almost midnight. My mother had been agitated, confused from the pain medication. She kept trying to get out of bed, saying she needed to get to work, that she'd be late, that her boss would fire her. The nurses tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen to them. She only settled when I held her hand and told her it was okay, that I'd called her boss, that she could rest. When she finally fell asleep, I sat in the chair beside her bed and cried as quietly as I could. A nurse I'd seen before, an older woman named Colette Merritt, brought me a box of tissues and a cup of hot chocolate from the nurse's station. How old are you, honey? She asked. 14. Do you have other family? Someone who can be here with you? My aunt comes sometimes. Colette looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her doing the calculation, what she should do, what she could do, what the system would allow. You shouldn't be going through this alone, she finally said. I'm not alone, I told her. I have my mom. Even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded. My mother was dying. Soon I would be alone. Colette squeezed my shoulder and went back to work. I stayed until security came by on their midnight rounds and told me I needed to leave. I took the night bus home. There was only one after 10 p.m., and it took a different route that added 20 minutes to the trip. I got to our apartment at 12:30, lay down in bed without changing clothes, and stared at the ceiling until my alarm went off at 6:30. I was falling asleep in class more frequently now. Not just in Mr. Granger's room, but everywhere. I'd be sitting in math class, listening to a lecture about polynomial equations, and I'd feel my eyes getting heavy, my head nodding forward. I'd jerk awake, heart pounding, hoping the teacher hadn't noticed. Usually they hadn't, or if they had, they didn't say anything. Most of my teachers were overworked and underpaid, dealing with 30 students per class, trying to meet curriculum standards and testing requirements. A quiet kid who occasionally dozed off wasn't a priority, but Mr. Granger noticed everything. The first time I fell asleep in his class was in mid-February, during a discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird. We were talking about Atticus Finch and the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Mr. Granger was asking the class to identify examples of moral courage in their own lives. I'd been at the hospital until 11:30 the night before. My mother had been having pain that the nurses couldn't control, and they'd had to call the overnight doctor to adjust her medication. I'd stayed because she kept asking for me, kept reaching for my hand. When I finally left, I'd missed the regular bus and had to wait 40 minutes for the night bus. I'd slept maybe 4 hours. I was trying so hard to stay awake in Mr. Granger's class, but the combination of exhaustion and the warm classroom and the drone of discussion was too much. My eyes closed. My head dropped forward. I was gone. I don't know how long I was asleep, probably just a few minutes. But I woke to an explosion of sound. Mr. Granger had slammed a thick textbook onto my desk with tremendous force. The bang was like a gunshot. I jerked awake so violently that I nearly fell out of my chair. My heart was hammering. For a confused second, I didn't know where I was. The entire class was staring at me. Some students looked shocked. A few were trying not to laugh. Mr. Granger stood over my desk, a textbook still in his hand, his face expressing something between disgust and satisfaction. He was a tall man despite his age, and from my seated position, he seemed to tower over me. "Mr. Kepler," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "how kind of you to join us. I'm sure your nap was more important than our discussion of one of the great works of American literature." My face was burning. I could feel the heat radiating from my cheeks. "I'm sorry," I mumbled. "You didn't mean to waste everyone's time? You didn't mean to demonstrate a complete lack of respect for this classroom and for me?" He turned to address the whole class, using me as an example. "This is what happens when young people are raised without discipline. They think the world should accommodate their laziness. They think their comfort matters more than their education." I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell him about my mother, about the hospital, about the fact that I'd had 4 hours of sleep and was running on nothing but fear and willpower. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't lazy, that I was trying so hard just to keep showing up. But I was 14 years old, and he was a teacher who'd been at this school for over 40 years, who was respected and feared in equal measure. I'd been raised to respect authority, to not talk back, to accept punishment when it came. So I said nothing. I sat there in my humiliation while my classmates stared at me, and I tried to stay awake for the remaining 30 minutes of class. I managed it that day, but it cost me everything I had. By the time I got to my next class, science with Mrs. Roxanne Phelps, I could barely function. Mrs. Phelps was a young teacher, maybe in her late 20s, and she was kind in a distracted way. When she saw me struggling to keep my eyes open during the lab demonstration, she asked if I was feeling okay. "Just tired," I said. "Make sure you're getting enough sleep," she said, not unkindly. "Growing boys need their rest." I almost laughed, or cried, I wasn't sure which. That night, my mother had a seizure. I was sitting beside her bed, trying to finish a homework assignment, when her body went rigid and started convulsing. I had never seen a seizure before. I thought she was dying right there in front of me. I ran into the hallway, screaming for help. Nurses came running. They got my mother onto her side, protected her head, timed the seizure. It lasted 47 seconds. I watched the clock on the wall, counting, unable to do anything else. When it was over, my mother was unconscious. The nurses called for a doctor. I stood against the wall, shaking while they worked on her. A young resident, I never learned his name, explained to me that seizures were common with brain metastases. The cancer had spread to my mother's brain. This was likely not the last seizure she'd have. They'd adjust her medications, try to prevent it from happening again, but I should be prepared. Prepared for what, I wanted to ask. Prepared to watch my mother's brain being destroyed by cancer? Prepared to lose her piece by piece? But I just nodded and said I understood. My mother woke up an hour later. She didn't remember the seizure. She was confused, disoriented, kept asking what day it was. I told her it was Tuesday. She asked me if I'd done my homework. I lied and said yes. I stayed until they kicked me out at midnight. I missed the regular bus and had to wait for the night bus again. I got home at 1:15 in the morning. I had to be up at 6:30 for school. I slept for 5 hours and 15 minutes. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. The second time I fell asleep in Mr. Granger's class was a week later. We were discussing The Great Gatsby, analyzing the symbolism of the green light in the Valley of Ashes. Mr. Granger was talking about the American dream and its corruption. I'd been at the hospital until midnight again. My mother had been in pain, crying, begging the nurses for more medication, even though she'd already had the maximum dose. I'd held her hand and tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort to give. Pain like that is isolating. It takes you to a place where no one can follow. In Mr. Granger's class, I was trying so hard to focus on his lecture. I was taking notes, writing down key points about symbolism and theme, but my handwriting kept getting sloppier, the words running together. My eyes were so heavy. The classroom was warm. Mr. Granger's voice became a distant drone. I fell asleep sitting up, pen still in my hand. This time, he didn't wake me with a book. He walked over to my desk silently, and the first thing I knew was his hand gripping my shoulder hard enough to hurt. I startled awake, gasping. "Stand up, Mr. Kepler," he said quietly. I stood, confused and disoriented. The class was watching with that same mixture of pity and morbid fascination. "Since you're clearly not interested in participating in our discussion," Mr. Granger said, "you can participate in a different way. Come to the front of the room." I walked to the front of the classroom on unsteady legs. I could feel every eye on me. "Turn and face the class," he instructed. I turned. My classmates stared back at me. Some looked uncomfortable, a few looked amused. Most just looked relieved it wasn't them. "You're going to stand there for the rest of the period," Mr. Granger said. "If you can't stay awake during my lesson, you can at least serve as a reminder to your classmates about what happens to students who don't take their education seriously." I stood there for the next 40 minutes. My legs started to ache after the first 10 minutes. By 20 minutes, I was swaying slightly, fighting to keep my eyes open. By 30 minutes, I thought I might actually fall over. Mr. Granger continued teaching as though I wasn't there. He discussed Gatsby's doomed love for Daisy, the impossibility of recapturing the past, the tragedy of misplaced devotion. He talked about how Gatsby had built his entire life around a fantasy, how his refusal to accept reality had destroyed him. I stood there thinking about my mother, about how I'd built my life around the fantasy that she might get better, that the doctors would find some treatment that worked, that I'd come to the hospital one day and she'd be sitting up in bed, smiling, telling me it was all going to be okay. The bell rang. Students gathered their things and filed out of the classroom. A few glanced at me as they passed, but no one said anything. When the room was empty except for Mr. Granger and me, he finally looked at me directly. "Do you understand why I did that, Mr. Kepler?" "Yes, sir." "Do you? Because I'm not convinced you understand anything. You come to my class. You disrespect me and your classmates by sleeping. You show no interest in learning, no drive to better yourself. Do you have any idea how insulting that is?" I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him that I was a 14-year-old kid watching his mother die, that I was doing everything I could just to survive, that I didn't have the luxury of caring about Gatsby's green light when my mother was having seizures and forgetting who I was. But I was so tired. Too tired to fight, too tired to explain. too tired to do anything except stand there and take it. I'm sorry, I whispered. Sorry isn't enough. Sorry doesn't excuse behavior. The real world doesn't care about sorry, Mr. Kepler. It cares about results. It cares about whether you show up and do the work. Right now, you're failing. You're failing my class, and more importantly, you're failing yourself. Do better. Yes, sir. He dismissed me with a wave of his hand. I grabbed my backpack and left the classroom. I made it to the bathroom before I started crying. I cried in a locked stall for 15 minutes, trying to be quiet, trying not to let anyone hear. When I finally came out, my eyes were red and my face was blotchy, but the halls were mostly empty. Lunch period was almost over, so no one saw. I went to my next class. I don't remember what it was. I don't remember anything from the rest of that day, except the weight of humiliation and exhaustion and grief pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. That night at the hospital, my mother's oncologist, Dr. Nadine Fairbanks, pulled me aside. Dr. Fairbanks was in her early 40s, competent and direct in a way I appreciated. She didn't sugarcoat things, but she also didn't deliver bad news cruelly. Nolan, she said, and the fact that she used my first name instead of calling me Mr. Kepler told me this was going to be bad. I need to talk to you about your mother's prognosis. We went to a small consultation room off the main hallway. The room had a table, a few chairs, and a box of tissues prominently displayed. The tissues told you everything you needed to know about what kind of conversations happened in this room. Your mother's cancer has progressed significantly, Dr. Fairbanks said. The metastases in her brain are growing despite treatment. She's having more frequent seizures. The pain is becoming harder to control. At this point, further chemotherapy would cause more harm than good. I knew what she was saying, but I asked anyway. How long? Weeks, maybe a month. I'm sorry. I sat there absorbing this information. Part of me had known for a while that my mother was dying, but knowing and being told are different things. Being told makes it real in a way that knowing doesn't. What happens now? I asked. We focus on keeping her comfortable. We'll manage her pain, make sure she's not suffering. If she wants to go home, we can arrange hospice care. If she's more comfortable here, she can stay. My mother couldn't go home. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor, no elevator. She could barely walk. And I was 14. I couldn't take care of her, couldn't manage her medications, couldn't handle what was coming. She'll stay here, I said. Dr. Fairbanks reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Is there family who can support you? Your aunt? She lives in Connecticut. But she's in contact? She's aware of the situation? Yeah. Dr. Fairbanks looked like she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. What could she say? I was a kid in an impossible situation, and there were no good solutions, only bad ones and worse ones. I went to my mother's room. She was asleep, her breathing labored. The seizure medication made her drowsy. She slept most of the time now. I sat in the chair, beside her bed, the same chair I'd sat in dozens of times over the past few months, and I held her hand. Her skin was thin and cool. Her pulse was visible in her wrist, fluttering like a bird. I thought about Mr. Granger's lecture on The Great Gatsby, about dreams and reality, about building your life around something that can never be real. I thought about how I'd been dreaming that my mother would survive, that somehow she'd beat the cancer, that we'd go back to our ordinary life in our small apartment. That dream was over. Reality was here, and it was brutal. I stayed until they made me leave. I took the buses home. I let myself into our empty apartment. Everything was exactly as my mother had left it the last time she'd been here. Her coffee mug still in the sink, her slippers by the bed, her reading glasses on the nightstand. I lay down in bed and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning. The third time I fell asleep in Mr. Granger's class was in early March, less than 2 weeks before my mother died. I'd been at the hospital until 2 in the morning. My mother had been agitated, trying to pull out her IV, convinced that people were in her room who weren't there. The hallucinations were getting worse as the cancer spread through her brain. The nurses had to restrain her gently, and I'd stayed because hearing my voice sometimes calmed her down. Sometimes, not always. Eventually, they'd given her enough medication to sedate her, and I'd taken the night bus home and slept for maybe 3 hours. I was a zombie the next day. I moved through the halls of Riverside Middle School like I was underwater, everything muffled and distant. I couldn't remember if I'd eaten breakfast. I couldn't remember the combination to my locker and had to try it 3 times before it opened. In Mr. Granger's class, we were discussing Lord of the Flies, the symbolism of the conch, the descent into savagery, the loss of civilization. I tried so hard to stay awake. I dug my fingernails into my palm hard enough to leave marks. I bit the inside of my cheek. I kept shifting position in my chair, trying to stay uncomfortable enough that I couldn't relax. It didn't work. Exhaustion has a gravity that you can't fight forever. I fell asleep during a discussion about the difference between Ralph and Jack, between order and chaos. I don't remember my eyes closing. One moment I was listening to Mr. Granger talk about leadership, and the next moment he was shaking my shoulder roughly, his voice loud and angry. "Mr. Kepler, wake up!" I jerked awake, disoriented and confused. The classroom came into focus slowly. Everyone was staring at me. Mr. Granger was standing over me, his face red with anger. "This is unacceptable," he said. "3 times you've fallen asleep in my class. 3 times I've had to stop teaching to deal with your disrespect. I've tried to be patient. I've tried to give you opportunities to correct your behavior, but you clearly have no interest in learning and no respect for this classroom." "I'm sorry," I said automatically. "I didn't mean—" "I don't want to hear it," he cut me off. "I'm sending you to the principal's office. Maybe Mr. Halverson can get through to you, because clearly I cannot." He was already writing on a disciplinary referral form. His handwriting was sharp and angry, the pen digging into the paper. I sat there numb while he finished writing. He handed me the referral without looking at me. "Go," he said. I took the paper and left the classroom. In the hallway, I finally looked at what he'd written. Student Nolan Kepler. Incident: repeated classroom disruption. Persistent sleeping during instruction despite multiple warnings and consequences. Recommendation: suspension and parent conference. Student demonstrates pattern of disrespect and laziness. Recommend evaluation for alternative placement if behavior continues. The words laziness and disrespect have been underlined twice. I walked to the principal's office. The secretary, an older woman named Belinda Larkin, looked at me with sympathy when I handed her the referral. "Have a seat, Nolan," she said gently. "Mr. Halverson will see you in a few minutes." I sat in one of the plastic chairs outside the principal's office and waited. Other kids passed in the hallway, heading to their next classes. They looked at me sitting there with the referral in my hand, and I could see them drawing conclusions. Nolan Kepler in trouble again. Nolan Kepler, the screw-up. After 10 minutes, Mr. Reed Halverson called me into his office. Principal Halverson was in his 50s, with thinning hair and a paunch that strained against his dress shirt. He cared about 2 things, test scores and keeping parents happy. Everything else was a distraction. He read the referral form his expression growing more annoyed with each line. When he finished, he looked at me with barely disguised irritation. "Mr. Kepler," he said, "this is the third time you've fallen asleep in Mr. Granger's class. What do you have to say for yourself?" I'd been dreading this question. I'd been rehearsing different ways to explain, different approaches to make him understand. But now that the moment was here, I couldn't find the right words. "My mother is in the hospital," I finally said. "She has cancer. I'm there every night. I'm trying to keep up with school, but I'm so tired." Mr. Halverson's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more annoyed, like I'd just tried to use a cheap excuse. "I understand that family situations can be difficult," he said in a tone that made it clear he neither understood nor cared. "But that doesn't excuse your behavior in the classroom. Mr. Granger is one of our most respected teachers. He's been at this school for 42 years. If he says you're being disruptive and disrespectful, I have to take that seriously." "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," I said, and I could hear my voice starting to shake. "I can't help falling asleep. I'm trying, but—" "Trying isn't enough, Mr. Kepler," he interrupted. "In the real world, results matter, not effort. Right now, your results are unacceptable. You're failing multiple classes. You're disrupting classrooms. You're not meeting the standards we expect from our students." He opened a file on his desk, my file apparently, and scanned through it. "Your grades have dropped significantly this year. You're currently failing English, social studies, and math. You've had multiple tardies and absences. Teachers report that when you are in class, you're often inattentive or sleeping." Each word felt like a blow. I knew my grades were bad. I knew I was failing. But hearing it laid out like this, presented as evidence of my failure, was crushing. "I'm giving you a 3-day suspension," Mr. Halverson said. "You'll return on Monday. When you come back, I expect to see a significant improvement in your behavior and your academic performance. If this continues, we'll have to consider whether Riverside is the right placement for you. There are alternative schools better equipped to handle students who can't meet our standards." Alternative schools. He meant schools for problem kids, for delinquents. He was threatening to send me away because I was falling asleep in class while my mother died. "Do you understand?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Good. I'm calling your guardian to inform them of the suspension." "Who should I call? Your mother?" "She's in the hospital. Call me Aunt, Lucinda Abbott. The number should be in my file." He made a note. "You can go. The suspension starts immediately." I left his office, walked past Mrs. Larkin, who gave me another sympathetic look, and left the school building. I should have gone home. That's what you're supposed to do when you're suspended. But I couldn't face going to our empty apartment. Couldn't face sitting there alone with nothing to do except think about how I was failing at everything. So I went to the hospital instead. It was only 11 in the morning. Visiting hours didn't officially start until noon. But the nurses on my mother's floor knew me. They let me in. My mother was awake when I arrived. She was having one of her increasingly rare moments of clarity. "Nolan," she said when she saw me, and her voice was weak but recognizable. "Why aren't you in school?" I thought about lying, but I was too tired. "I got suspended." "Suspended? What happened?" "I keep falling asleep in class. The teacher sent me to the principal." My mother's face crumpled. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry. This is my fault." "It's not your fault. You're sick." "Did you tell them? Did you explain?" "I tried. They don't care." She started crying then, tears running down her gaunt face. "You should be in school. You should be learning, being with friends, being normal. Instead, you're here, watching me die. Don't say that. It's true, I'm dying, and I'm taking you down with me. Mom, stop. But she couldn't stop. The medication, the cancer, the stress, it all came pouring out. She cried and apologized and said she should have been stronger, should have fought harder, should have been a better mother. I held her hand and told her she was the best mother anyone could have. Told her none of this was her fault. Told her I loved her. Eventually, the crying exhausted her and she fell asleep. I sat beside her bed for the rest of the day, watching her breathe, thinking about the suspension and the principal's threat, and the way Mr. Granger had looked at me with such contempt. I thought about what my mother had said, that she was taking me down with her. She was wrong. She wasn't taking me down. The world was. The system was. All the people who were supposed to help but didn't, who saw a kid struggling and just punished him for it. I stayed until visiting hours ended at 10 p.m. When I finally left, I saw Nurse Colette at the nurse's station. "Nolan," she called out, "come here for a second." I walked over to her. She looked at me seriously. "Your mother doesn't have much time left," she said quietly. "Days, maybe a week. You should prepare yourself." "I know." "Is your aunt coming? You shouldn't be alone when it happens." "She said she'd come if we call her." Colette nodded slowly. "Okay, but Nolan, you shouldn't be going through this by yourself. You're just a kid." "I'm 14. "Exactly, you're just a kid." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said goodnight and left. The 3-day suspension was almost a relief. I didn't have to pretend to be a student. I didn't have to sit in classes I couldn't focus on. I could just be what I was, a kid watching his mother die. I spent all 3 days at the hospital. The nurses didn't comment on it. They brought me food from the cafeteria, let me use the staff bathroom when the visitor bathroom was occupied, treated me like I was part of the furniture. My mother drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she was usually confused. She'd ask me what year it was, or where my father was, or whether she needed to go to work. Sometimes she'd look at me like she couldn't quite place who I was. A few moments when she was clear, though precious and terrible. She'd realize what was happening and she'd panic, or she'd cry, or she'd try to tell me things she wanted me to remember. "Be good," she said once, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Be better than this. Don't let this break you." But I was already broken. I just didn't realize it yet. On the 3rd day of my suspension, Friday, my mother slipped into a coma. Dr. Fairbanks explained that this was common at the end. The brain shutting down bit by bit. She might wake up, might have another lucid moment, but it was unlikely. They asked if I wanted them to call my aunt. I said yes. Lucinda arrived that evening with her husband, Marshall Calder. They looked uncomfortable and out of place in the hospital room. Lucinda kept wringing her hands, looking at her sister's unconscious body like she didn't know what to do. "How long?" Marshall asked. "Days," I said. "Maybe less." "Oh God," Lucinda whispered. They stayed for an hour, then said they had to get back to Connecticut. They had to get home to their kids. They'd come back tomorrow, Lucinda promised. They'd be here. They left. I stayed. I returned to school on Monday. My mother was still alive, still in the coma, but the hospital told me I should try to maintain some normalcy, that there was nothing I could do by sitting at her bedside all day. Walking back into Riverside Middle School felt surreal. Everything looked the same halls, the same lockers, the same groups of kids clustered together talking and laughing. But I felt like I'd been gone for years instead of days. Nobody asked where I'd been. Nobody said anything about the suspension. I was invisible. Again, which was fine. Mr. Granger's class was 4th period. I dreaded it, But I had to go. I couldn't afford more suspensions, more trouble. When I walked into the classroom, Mr. Granger barely glanced at me. "Mr. Kepler," he said neutrally, "take your seat." I sat in my usual spot, middle of the room. The other students were quieter than usual. Kara Abbott, the girl who'd tried to talk to me after one of the earlier incidents, looked at me with obvious concern. We were still reading Lord of the Flies. Mr. Granger lectured about the degradation of civilization, how quickly order can collapse into chaos. He used the word savage a lot. I stayed awake through sheer force of will. I dug my fingernails into my palms until they left marks. I bit my cheek hard enough to taste blood. I did everything I could to keep my eyes open. I made it through the class. When the bell rang, I gathered my things and tried to leave quickly. "Mr. Kepler," Mr. Granger called out, "a moment, please." My stomach dropped. I walked to his desk. He was grading papers, his pen moving across the page with sharp, decisive marks. He didn't look up at me when he spoke. "I trust your suspension gave you time to reflect on your behavior." "Yes, sir." "Good, because I won't tolerate any more disruptions in my classroom. You're already failing. Your current grade is 17%. If you want any chance of passing 8th grade, you need to turn things around immediately." He finally looked up at me, and his expression was one of complete disdain. "I've been teaching for over 40 years, Mr. Kepler. I've seen thousands of students come through this classroom. Some are bright, some are average, some are below average. But the ones who fail, the ones who don't make it, are always the same. They're lazy. They make excuses. They think the world should accommodate their problems." He tapped my baby foot with one finger. "You're lazy, Mr. Kepler, you're personal. You can show up half asleep, put in no effort, and still pass. That's not how the world works. The real world doesn't care about your excuses. The real world rewards hard work and punishes mediocrity. The sooner you learn that lesson, the better off you'll be." I stood there looking at this old man who had no idea what was happening in my life, who saw me as nothing more than a lazy student who needed to be taught a lesson, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, something colder than anger. "Do you have anything to say?" he asked. I wanted to tell him about my mother. I wanted to explain that she was dying, that I'd spent the last 3 days watching her slip away, that I was doing everything I could just to survive. I wanted to make him understand. But I looked at his face, at the certainty there, and I knew he wouldn't listen. He'd made up his mind about who I was. Nothing I said would change that. "No, sir," I said quietly. "Then you're dismissed." I left his classroom, and I made a promise to myself. I would never be helpless again. I would never be in a position where people like him could dismiss me, could judge me, could decide that I was worthless without knowing anything about me. I didn't know how I'd do it. I didn't have a plan. But I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to become someone who couldn't be ignored. My mother died 4 days later, on Tuesday, March 19th. I was at school when it happened. I'd been in the hospital every night, watching her slow decline, but that particular morning the nurses had told me she was stable, that I should go to class, that they'd call if anything changed. I was in Mr. Granger's class when the school secretary came to the door and called my name. I knew immediately. I stood up, grabbed my backpack, and walked to the door without looking at anyone. Mrs. Larkin was in the hallway, and her face told me everything. "Nolan," she said gently, "the hospital called. You need to go there right away. Your aunt is on her way." I left the building. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, gray and cold. I took the buses to St. Mary's Medical Center one last time. When I arrived, they directed me to my mother's room. Lucinda was there, crying. A doctor I didn't recognize was making notes on a chart. The machines that had been beeping and humming for months were silent. My mother's body was in the bed, small and still. The cancer had taken so much from her. Her hair, her weight, her strength, her mind. Now it had taken everything. I sat beside her bed and held her hand. Her skin was already cooling. The nurses had cleaned her up, made her look peaceful. She didn't look like herself. She looked like a wax figure, a museum display. Lucinda kept crying and apologizing. I should have been here more. I should have helped you both. I'm so sorry, Nolan. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, holding my mother's hand, trying to memorize the feel of it because soon she'd be gone completely, and this would be the last time. A chaplain came and said some words. They asked if I wanted to call anyone. I didn't know anyone to call. Eventually, they said I had to leave. They needed to prepare the body for the funeral home. Lucinda said I should come home with her, to Connecticut, that I'd live with them now. I took one last look at my mother's body, and then I left. The funeral was small. A few people from my mother's old jobs came. April Fowler from the hospital social work department came. Nurse Colette came. A couple of neighbors from my apartment building came. Mr. Granger didn't come. Neither did Mr. Halverson. Nobody from Riverside Middle School came. I stood by the gravesite in a suit that was too small for me. I'd grown over the past few months without noticing, and listened to words that meant nothing. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. God's will. She's in a better place. None of it was true. She wasn't in a better place. She was in a hole in the ground, and I was alone. After the funeral, I went to live with Lucinda and Marshall in Connecticut. Their house was in West Hartford, a suburb that was nice enough. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a 2-car garage. They had 2 kids, Mallory, who was 11, and Grant, who was 9. Normal kids with normal lives and normal problems. Lucinda set up the guest room for me. She'd bought new sheets, put up some posters she thought a teenage boy would like. Sports teams I didn't care about. She was trying in her way. But it was clear from the beginning that I was an obligation, not family. I was the dead sister's kid, the charity case, the reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Marshall was polite but distant. He worked in insurance, left for the office at 7 in the morning, came home at 6:30 at night. He'd ask how my day was at dinner, but you could tell he wasn't really listening to the answer. Mallory and Grant were fine. They were kids. They didn't know how to act around the grieving teenager who'd suddenly appeared in their home, so they mostly avoided me. I finished 8th grade remotely. The school in Massachusetts sent packets of work, worksheets, assignments, a few exams. I completed them minimally, turned them in late. I graduated with D's and F's, a 1.8 GPA. Nobody from Riverside reached out. Not Mr. Granger, not Mr. Halverson, not a single teacher who might have wondered what happened to the kid who'd been falling asleep in class. They'd already forgotten me. I was just another student who didn't make it, another kid who couldn't hack it, another statistic. That summer, I spent most of my time alone. Lucinda tried to include me in family activities, trips to the beach, cookouts with their friends, mini golf with the kids. I went along because I had to, but I felt like a ghost in someone else's life. I thought about my mother constantly. Wondered if I could have done something different, wondered if I should have been a better student, kept my grades up, not caused problems. Wondered if my failures had added to her stress, if somehow I'd made things worse. But mostly, I thought about Mr. Granger and Mr. Halverson, and all the people who'd looked at me struggling and just saw laziness, saw disrespect, saw a kid who needed to be punished. I thought about Mr. Granger's words. The real world doesn't care about your excuses. The real world rewards hard work and punishes mediocrity. He was right. The world didn't care. It had taken my mother and left me with nothing. But I was going to care. I was going to work harder than anyone. I was going to become someone who couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be ignored, couldn't be called lazy or mediocre or worthless. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I was going to do it. I started high school that September at Fairview High in West Hartford. It was a large school, over 2,000 students, with a reputation for academic excellence. The building was modern, the resources were good, and the student body was predominantly white and upper middle class. I was none of those things. I was the kid with dead parents living with reluctant relatives. The kid with a barely passing GPA from a different state. The kid who didn't know anyone and didn't want to. I didn't try to fit in. I went to class, did the bare minimum to pass, went back to Lucinda's house. I ate dinner with the family in silence, did my homework in my room, went to bed early. Lucinda and Marshall seemed relieved that I wasn't causing trouble. As long as I kept my head down, as long as I didn't disrupt their comfortable life, I could exist in their house like a piece of furniture they'd acquired and didn't quite know what to do with. But something was building inside me during those first months of high school. Not hope. I didn't have hope anymore, but determination. A cold, quiet determination. I'd been told I was lazy. I'd been told I was a failure. I'd been told I'd never amount to anything. And I realized that the only way to prove everyone wrong was to become someone they couldn't ignore. So I started reading. I went to the West Hartford Public Library after school and checked out books on biology, chemistry, human anatomy. I didn't know why exactly. Maybe because my mother had died of cancer, and I wanted to understand what had killed her. Maybe because medicine felt like power, like control over the thing that had taken everything from me. I read textbooks meant for college students. I read medical journals that I barely understood at first. I taught myself Latin root words so I could decode medical terminology. I spent hours on Khan Academy, working through advanced biology and chemistry modules. Nobody noticed. My grades at Fairview stayed mediocre, B's and C's, because I didn't care about the busy work that high school required. But I was learning, systematically and obsessively, the foundations of medicine. By sophomore year, I had made a decision. I was going to be a doctor. Not a general practitioner, a surgeon, specifically a neurosurgeon. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't have anyone to tell, but I knew. The problem was obvious. I had mediocre grades, no extracurriculars, no money, and no support system. Getting into college seemed difficult. Getting into medical school seemed impossible. But I'd learned something important in 8th grade, watching my mother die while teachers told me to try harder. The world doesn't care about your obstacles. It cares about results. So I built a plan. First, I needed hospital experience. I started volunteering at Hartford General Hospital on weekends. The work was menial. I was a candy striper, delivering meals, helping patients to the bathroom, changing linens, filing charts. But it got me inside a hospital where I could watch doctors work, where I could learn how the system functioned. I befriended a neurosurgical resident named Dr. Felix Norwood. Felix was brilliant and exhausted, perpetually running on coffee and adrenaline. He worked 100-hour weeks and still found time to answer questions from a curious high school kid who brought him coffee during his 36-hour shifts. Why neurosurgery? Felix asked me one night while we sat in an empty OR hallway at 3 in the morning, waiting for his next case. Because it's the hardest, I said. Felix laughed. That's a terrible reason. But it wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I wanted to do something that required absolute precision, where there was no room for error, where success was earned through skill and discipline and nothing else, where you couldn't coast, where you couldn't make excuses. Felix let me observe surgeries from the gallery. He gave me textbooks of used in medical school, principles of neuroscience, Gray's anatomy, operative neurosurgery. As a biology, junior year I finally started caring about my grades, not because I suddenly became a better student, but because I realized they were a tool I needed. I needed a GPA high enough to get into a decent college with financial aid. So I calculated exactly which classes mattered for college admissions, which assignments I needed to ace, which tests I needed to study for. I optimized ruthlessly. I took AP Biology, AP Chemistry, AP Calculus. I studied for hours every night, not because I was passionate about high school coursework, but because I needed the GPA. My grades climbed from a 2.8 to a 3.6 in one semester. Teachers were surprised. Lucinda was surprised. I didn't care about their surprise. I cared about results. I took the SAT 3 times, studying for months before each attempt. First score, 1,140. Second score, 1,320. Third score, 1,450. It still wasn't Harvard material, but combined with my improved GPA and the hospital volunteering, it might be enough. Senior year, I applied to 11 colleges, all with strong pre-med programs and generous financial aid policies. I wrote my personal essay about watching my mother die and deciding to become a doctor so that other kids wouldn't have to go through what I went through. It was manipulative and I knew it, but I didn't care. I needed to get in somewhere. I got rejected from 7 schools, waitlisted at 1, accepted to 3. I chose the University of Massachusetts Amherst because it was cheap. It had a good biology program, and the financial aid package covered almost everything. When I told Lucinda I was going to college, she looked relieved. "That's wonderful, Nolan," she said, and I could hear the subtext. "That's wonderful. You'll be leaving soon." I'd lived in her house for 4 years. In all that time, we'd never had a real conversation. She'd fulfilled her obligation to her dead sister by taking me in, feeding me, giving me a place to sleep. I'd fulfilled my obligation by not causing problems. That was all either of us could say about our relationship. I left for UMass in August, 3 weeks before my 18th birthday. Lucinda and Marshall drove me to campus, helped me move into my dorm room, and left after 30 minutes. Mallory and Grant hadn't even come. They were at soccer camp. I stood in my empty dorm room, looking at the bare walls and the institutional furniture, and I felt nothing. No sadness, no excitement, no fear. Just a cold determination to do what I'd set out to do. College was different from high school in one important way. Nobody knew me. Nobody knew my history, knew about my mother, knew about 8th grade. I could be anyone. I chose to be exactly what I needed to be, a pre-med student with perfect grades and no life outside studying. I took organic chemistry, biochemistry, molecular biology, advanced human anatomy. I worked 20 hours a week in the UMass University Health Services ER, first as an orderly cleaning rooms and transporting patients, then as a phlebotomist once I got certified. I slept 5 hours a night. I didn't go to parties. I didn't join clubs. I didn't date. I had acquaintances in my classes, people I studied with occasionally, but no friends. People thought I was weird, obsessive, antisocial. They were right, but I didn't care what they thought. I finished my first year with a 3.94 GPA. The only A- was an English composition, a required course that I considered a waste of time. Sophomore year, I added physics and genetics. I started working in a research lab studying glioblastoma, the same type of cancer that would eventually bring Seth Granger to my operating room, though I didn't know that yet. I spent 20 hours a week running Western blots and maintaining cell cultures. My GPA stayed above 3.9. I studied the MCAT like it was a holy text. I took practice exams every weekend, analyzed my mistakes, drilled my weak areas. Junior year, I took the MCAT and scored a 523 out of 528, 99th percentile. I applied to 15 medical schools, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Penn, Stanford, and 11 others. I got into 2, a mid-tier program in Pennsylvania, and Boston University School of Medicine. I chose Boston. The tuition was higher, but the residency placement rates were better, and I'd learned by now that every decision should be strategic, should move me closer to my goal. Medical school was brutal in exactly the way I'd expected. Everyone there was smart. Everyone had been at the top of their undergraduate class. Everyone was driven and competitive and willing to sacrifice everything for success. I fit right in. First year was basic sciences, anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology. We dissected a cadaver, learned every muscle and nerve and blood vessel. We memorized drug mechanisms and disease processes. We took exams that covered hundreds of pages of material. I studied 12 hours a day. I lived in the library. I ate meals at my desk while reviewing flashcards. I slept in 4-hour blocks. Second year added clinical skills. We learned to take histories, do physical exams, present cases. We practiced on standardized patients, actors who were paid to pretend they were sick. We learned to look sympathetic while maintaining professional distance. I was good at the professional distance part. The sympathy was harder, but I learned to fake it. Third year was clinical rotations, surgery, internal medicine, pediatrics, psychiatry, obstetrics. We worked 80-hour weeks, following residents and attendings, doing scut work, trying not to kill anyone through our ignorance. The surgery rotation was where I knew, definitively, that I'd made the right choice. I loved the OR, the precision, the stakes, the immediate results. You either saved the patient or you didn't. There was no ambiguity. I loved neurosurgery specifically. The brain was the most complex organ, the operations were the most difficult, and the margin for error was the smallest. One wrong cut could leave someone paralyzed, aphasic, dead. Most medical students found that terrifying. I found it clarifying. Fourth year, I applied for neurosurgery residency. It's one of the most competitive specialties in medicine. Fewer than 200 positions in the entire country, all going to the best students from the best schools. I ranked Boston Presbyterian Hospital first. It was one of the top neurosurgery programs in the country, with a 7-year residency that would train me to operate on the most complex cases. Match day was in March of my 4th year. That's the day when medical students find out where they'll spend the next several years of their lives. You get an envelope. You open it in front of your classmates and faculty. Everyone cheers or looks sympathetic depending on whether you match with your top choice. I opened my envelope alone in my apartment because I didn't have anyone to celebrate with and didn't want fake congratulations from classmates I'd never bonded with. The letter said, "Congratulations, you have matched to Boston Presbyterian Hospital for neurological surgery." I'd done it. Against all odds, Starting from a 1.8 GPA in 8th grade, I'd matched to one of the best neurosurgery programs in the country. I didn't celebrate. I just sat with the letter for a few minutes, then got back to studying for my final exams. Residency was 7 years of controlled brutality. First year, I worked 100-hour weeks. I did scut work, drawing blood, placing IVs, admitting patients at 3 a.m. I held retractors during surgeries for hours, my arms burning, watching attendings operate on brains while I tried to absorb everything. Second year, I started operating myself, under supervision on simple cases, burr holes to drain blood, VP shunts to relieve hydrocephalus, straightforward decompressions. Third and fourth years, the cases got harder. Tumor resections, aneurysm clippings, spine fusions. I operated dozens of times per week, got better with each case. Fifth and sixth years, I was operating on the complex cases, the ones that other surgeons didn't want because the risk was too high. Brainstem tumors, arteriovenous malformations, parasagittal meningiomas. I had a 91% success rate, which was exceptional. Seventh year, I was chief resident. I supervised the junior residents, managed the service, took the most difficult cases. I finished my residency at age 32 with excellent evaluations, multiple publications, and a job offer to stay on as an attending at Boston Presbyterian. I accepted. By age 35, I was one of the best neurosurgeons in New England. I specialized in pediatric brain tumors, the cases that had the smallest margins, the highest stakes, the worst odds. I had a 94% success rate on surgeries with a national average of 72%. I published papers in the Journal of Neurosurgery and the New England Journal of Medicine. I gave talks at conferences. I trained residents who went on to top positions at other hospitals. I made good money. Neurosurgeons are among the highest paid physicians. I had a 401k, a mortgage-free condo in Boston, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that ran fine. I dated occasionally, a few relationships that lasted a few months before ending when the woman realized I wasn't capable of real intimacy. I couldn't blame them. I'd built walls so high that I couldn't get over them myself. By the time I was 40, I had everything I'd set out to achieve. I was successful, respected, financially secure. I'd proven everyone wrong, Mr. Granger, Mr. Halverson, everyone who'd dismissed me as lazy or worthless. I'd won, and I was completely empty. I thought about my mother sometimes, wondered what she'd think of me, whether she'd be proud of what I'd accomplished or sad about what I'd become. I thought about 8th grade occasionally, about those months when everything fell apart. But I didn't dwell on it. The past was past. I'd moved on. I'd built a new life. I was fine. And then, 17 years after my mother died, a boy named Seth Granger arrived at my hospital. He was 14 years old. He'd been having headaches for 6 months, the kind that got worse over time, that made him vomit in the mornings, that made bright lights unbearable. His pediatrician had ordered an MRI. The MRI showed a glioblastoma in his left temporal lobe, aggressive brain cancer, the kind that kills quickly. 2 neurosurgeons had already reviewed the case and declined to operate. The tumor was too large, too entangled with critical structures. The risk of permanent damage was too high. His parents were desperate. They'd been referred to me as a last resort. I reviewed the scans in my office. The tumor was indeed large, 4 centimeters, which is huge for a brain tumor. It was wrapped around the middle cerebral artery, pressing against Broca's area. Surgery would be extraordinarily difficult, but it was possible. Technically challenging, high risk, but possible. I scheduled a consultation with the family. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I met them in my clinic, an exam room with a desk, a computer, a box of tissues on the counter. The tissues are always there. Brain tumor consultations often involve crying. The patient, Seth Granger, was a thin 14-year-old with dark circles under his eyes. He moved carefully, like his head hurt. His mother, Francesca Granger, was in her early 50s, blonde, clearly trying to hold herself together, and his father was Victor Granger. Old now, he had to be in his 80s, but unmistakably the same man who taught me 8th grade English at Riverside Middle School. I felt something cold settle in my chest, but my face didn't change. I'd learned in medical school how to control my expressions, how to maintain professional neutrality no matter what I was feeling. "Mr. and Mrs. Granger," I said, shaking their hands. "And you must be Seth. I didn't make the connection then. Or rather, I noted the name Granger, but didn't think anything of it. It's a common enough name. Victor's a common enough first name." I explained the situation to them. Seth had a grade 4 glioblastoma, the most aggressive type of brain cancer. Without treatment, life expectancy was measured in months. With radiation and chemotherapy alone, maybe 6 to 9 months. Surgery offered the possibility of longer survival, but it was high risk. "What are the risks?" Francesca asked, gripping her son's hand. "Stroke, bleeding, infection, permanent damage to speech or movement, death on the operating table." I ticked them off clinically. "The risk of major complications is approximately 30 to 40%. "And if you don't operate?" Victor asked. His voice was weaker than I remembered, an old man's voice. "Then the tumor will continue growing. The headaches will get worse. Eventually there will be seizures, loss of function, and death." Francesca started crying. Seth looked scared, but was trying to be brave. Victor looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 5 minutes since entering my office. "What would you recommend, Dr. Kepler?" Victor asked. I looked at him, this old man who'd once called me a disgrace, and I felt nothing, just professional detachment. "I recommend surgery," I said. "The tumor's operable. It won't cure the cancer. You'll still need radiation and chemotherapy afterward, but it will buy time, possibly significant time. The alternative is certain death within months." They talked among themselves. Francesca wanted to know if there were other doctors, other opinions. I explained that 2 other neurosurgeons had already reviewed the case and declined. "You're our last chance," Victor said. "I am your best chance," I corrected. "I've operated on tumors like this before. I have a 94% success rate in complex pediatric cases." We talked for another 20 minutes. I showed them the MRI images, explained exactly what I'd do during the surgery, what the recovery would look like. At the end of the consultation, they agreed to the surgery. I scheduled it for the following week. It wasn't until the night before the surgery that I made the full connection. I was reviewing Seth's patient file at home, preparing for the case the way I always did, when I saw Victor Granger's employment history. Retired teacher, Riverside Middle School, Massachusetts. 43 years of service. I sat there staring at that line, and everything came back. The hospital rooms, my mother dying, falling asleep in class, standing at the front of the room for 40 minutes while Mr. Granger taught about Gatsby and ignored me. "You're lazy, Mr. Kepler. You're a disgrace. The real world doesn't care about your excuses." I pulled up more information, found an old faculty photo from Riverside's website archives. There he was, Mr. Victor Granger, younger but recognizable, standing with other teachers in front of the school. I could have transferred the case. I could have called in one of my colleagues, Dr. Wesley Dunbar or Dr. Isaac Radner. and said I had a conflict of interest. Nobody would have questioned it, but I didn't. I'm a surgeon. I'd taken an oath to do no harm. My personal feelings don't matter when there's a patient on my operating table. At least, that's what I told myself. The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. I arrived at the hospital at 5, started reviewing the scans again, going over the approach I'd planned. The circulating nurse came in to check on me. "Big case today, Dr. Kepler," she said. "They're all big cases, Holly." At 6 a.m., I went to pre-op to see Seth. He was already sedated, groggy, but awake. Francesca was sitting beside him, holding his hand. Victor was standing against the wall, looking frail and frightened. "Dr. Kepler," Francesca said when she saw me, "thank you for doing this. Thank you for giving him a chance." "I'm going to do everything I can," I said. I turned to Seth. "How are you feeling?" "Scared," he admitted. "That's normal. But you're in good hands. I've done this before, many times. You're going to go to sleep, and when you wake up, it'll be over." "Will I be okay?" I could have given him the statistical answer: 30 to 40% risk of complications, 60 to 70% chance of good outcome. But he was 14 and scared and facing brain surgery. "I'm going to do my very best to make sure you're okay," I said. Francesca hugged me, crying, Thank you so much." Victor shook my hand. His grip was weak, trembling. "Please save my son," he said. "He's all we have. He's everything." I looked into his eyes and saw no recognition. Why would there be? I was just another doctor. He'd taught hundreds, maybe thousands of students over 43 years. I was nobody to him, a 14-year-old kid who'd fallen asleep in class 2 decades ago, forgettable, forgotten. "I'll do my best, Mr. Granger," I said. The anesthesia team came to take Seth to the OR. Francesca kissed her son's forehead. Victor squeezed his hand. Then he was wheeled away, and the Grangers were left in the waiting room to wait for the next 9 hours. I scrubbed in. The OR was cold, brightly lit, filled with the sound of machines. Seth was already under general anesthesia, his head secured in a Mayfield clamp, his skull shaved and prepped. My surgical team was ready. Dr. Jocelyn Easton, my senior resident, Dr. Everett Iles, the anesthesiologist, Holly Morley, my scrub nurse who worked with me for years. "Ready, Dr. Pepper?" Jocelyn asked. "Ready." I made the first incision. Brain surgery is methodical, precise, slow. You can't rush. Every movement matters. Every cut is irreversible. I opened the skull with a craniotomy, creating a window into Seth's brain. The dura mater, the membrane covering the brain, was tight, swollen from the tumor's mass effect. I opened it carefully, relieving the pressure. And there was the tumor, grayish-white, vascular, ugly. It was larger than the scan suggested, more invasive, more entangled with the surrounding tissue. I started resecting it, using the ultrasonic aspirator to break it up and suction it away, millimeter by millimeter, monitoring the neurological probes to make sure I wasn't damaging critical areas. 4 hours in, I had removed about 60% of the tumor, but the rest was wrapped around the middle cerebral artery, Seth's brain's main blood supply to the language and motor areas. If I damaged it, he could lose speech, movement, or die from a stroke. "This is the difficult part," I said to Jocelyn, who was assisting. "Watch closely." I dissected carefully around the artery, using micro-instruments, working under the surgical microscope. The margin between success and disaster was measured in millimeters. 6 hours in, I'd removed 85% of the tumor. My hands were cramping. My back ached from leaning over the table, but I kept going. 8 hours in, I'd removed 97% of the tumor. The remaining 3% was too risky to pursue. It was infiltrating into critical tissue, and removing it would almost certainly cause permanent damage. 97% was good. Better than good. It was excellent. I controlled the bleeding, irrigated the surgical field, closed the dura, replaced the bone flap, closed the scalp. 9 hours after starting, I finished. Seth's vitals were stable. The anesthesiologist started lightening the anesthesia. Within 30 minutes, Seth was waking up, following commands, squeezing hands when asked. I went to the waiting room to talk to the Grangers. They'd been there for 9 hours, waiting, probably not talking much, just existing in that horrible limbo of not knowing. When they saw me in my scrubs, they both stood up. Francesca looked terrified. Victor looked like he might collapse. The surgery went well, I said. I removed approximately 97% of the tumor. Seth is waking up now. He's following commands, which is a very good sign. Francesca started crying again, but this time from relief. Victor's face crumpled. He looked like he might cry too. "Can we see him?" Francesca asked. "He'll be in recovery for about an hour. Then he'll go to the ICU. You can see him then." "Is he going to be okay?" Victor asked. "The surgery went as well as it could have. He'll need radiation and chemotherapy to treat the remaining tumor cells, but we've bought him time. The pathology report will take a few days, but we know it's glioblastoma. That means the road ahead will be difficult, but he has a chance now." They thanked me effusively, emotionally. I accepted their gratitude with professional courtesy and left to write my operative note. Over the next week, I followed Seth's recovery closely. He was doing remarkably well. No neurological deficits, no complications. He was young and healthy, and his brain was resilient. The pathology confirmed glioblastoma multiforme, grade 4. The oncology team started planning radiation and chemotherapy. The prognosis is still guarded. Average survival for glioblastoma is 14 months with aggressive treatment. But Seth was young. He had an excellent resection, and sometimes young patients beat the odds. The Grangers visited every day. Francesca would chat with the nurses, bring Seth's favorite foods, try to keep his spirits up. Victor would sit quietly by the bed, holding his son's hand, looking haunted. I came by to check on Seth daily. Each time, the Grangers thanked me again. Each time, Victor looked at me like I was a miracle worker. He still didn't recognize me. 2 weeks after the surgery, Seth was discharged. He'd need close follow-up, regular MR is, but he was well enough to go home. The day before discharge, Victor approached me in the hallway outside Seth's room. "Dr. Kepler," he said, and I heard the hesitation when he said my name. "I wanted to thank you properly. When Seth is a bit stronger, we're planning a small gathering at our home. Family and close friends, just to celebrate his recovery. We'd be honored if you could attend." This was unusual. Doctors don't typically socialize with patients' families. Professional boundaries exist for good reasons. But I looked at this old man, this man who'd called me lazy, who'd humiliated me, who'd never bothered to ask why I was falling asleep in class, and I made a decision. "I'd be happy to attend," I said. The gathering was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late October, about 6 weeks after the surgery. The Grangers lived in Newton, a suburb west of Boston, in a well-maintained colonial that teachers used to be able to afford before housing prices exploded. I drove there in my Honda, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt. Professional but not formal, I brought nothing. This wasn't a celebration I was invited to join. This was something else. There were maybe 30 people there when I arrived. Family members, neighbors, some of Victor's old teaching colleagues, a few of Seth's friends from school. Seth was doing well. His hair was growing back, though it was still short and patchy. He'd lost weight from the radiation and chemo, but he was alive, mobile, laughing with his friends. Francesca greeted me at the door. "Dr. Kepler, I'm so glad you could make it. Seth will be thrilled you're here." She led me through the house, introducing me to people. "This is Dr. Kepler, the neurosurgeon who saved Seth's life." People shook my hand, thanked me, treated me like a hero. I smiled politely and accepted their gratitude. Victor was in the living room, talking with an older couple. When he saw me, he excused himself and came over. "Dr. Kepler," he said warmly, "thank you for coming. This means so much to our family." "Of course." He looked at me, and something flickered in his expression. That hesitation again, like he was trying to place me. "You know, it's the strangest thing," he said. "Your last name, Kepler. I taught hundreds of students over the years, and I could swear I once taught a boy named Kepler. But that was long ago, and I can't quite remember." "Perhaps you did," I said neutrally. Before he could pursue the thought, Francesca called everyone into the living room. It was time for speeches, apparently. People gathered, holding glasses of wine or soda. Victor stood in the center of the room. He looked old and fragile, but his voice was still strong. Still the voice of a teacher who'd commanded classrooms for 43 years. "I want to thank you all for being here," he said. 6 weeks ago, Francesca and I faced every parent's worst nightmare. Our son, our only child, had an aggressive brain tumor. 2 surgeons told us there was nothing we could do. We thought we were going to lose him. His voice cracked. Francesca put her hand on his arm. "And then we met Dr. Kepler," Victor continued. "Dr. Nolan Kepler, who took a case that others wouldn't touch, who gave us hope when we had none, who spent 9 hours operating on our son's brain and saved his life." People applauded. I stood there, expressionless. "Dr. Kepler is an extraordinary surgeon," Victor said. "But more than that, he's an extraordinary human being. Our family will be forever grateful for what he's done." More applause. People were looking at me, smiling, raising their glasses. I waited for the applause to fade. Then I spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Granger. But before we go any further, there's something I need to say." The room went quiet. Francesca looked at me, still smiling, not understanding what was coming. Seth was sitting on the couch, looking at me with trust and admiration. Victor looked at me, still not understanding. "I did save Seth's life," I said, my voice calm and level. "I performed a surgery that gave him a chance he wouldn't have had otherwise. I did my job, and I did it well." I paused. "But I want you all to know who I am, Mr. Granger. My full name is Nolan Kepler. I was a student at Riverside Middle School in Massachusetts. I was in your 8th grade English class." I watched the recognition hit him, watched his face go pale, his eyes widen with shock and sudden understanding. "In 8th grade, I continued, speaking to the room but watching him. "My mother was dying of cancer. I spent every night at the hospital with her, watching her deteriorate. I'd come to school exhausted, barely able to function. I fell asleep in your class, Mr. Granger, and you called me lazy. You humiliated me in front of my classmates. You made me stand at the front of the room as an example. You sent me to the principal's office with a referral that said I was disrespectful and needed to be suspended." Francesca had stopped smiling. The room was absolutely silent. "I tried to tell you what was happening," I said. "I tried to explain about my mother, but you didn't want to know. You told me the world doesn't care about excuses. You told me I needed to learn discipline, that I was lazy and worthless and a disgrace." Victor was trembling. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My mother died on March 19th, the same year you taught me those lessons. I was 14 years old. I had nobody. My aunt took me in because she had to, not because she wanted to. I finished 8th grade with failing grades. And nobody from Riverside Middle School, not you, not the principal, not a single teacher, ever reached out to ask if I was okay. Someone in the room, a woman I didn't know, gasped. Several people looked horrified. I became a doctor because I didn't want to be helpless ever again, I said. I became a neurosurgeon because I wanted to do something that required absolute precision, where there was no room for excuses, where success was earned through skill and discipline and nothing else. I paused, making sure everyone was listening. Everything you said about hard work and discipline and the real world, you were right. I learned those lessons. I just learned them in spite of you, not because of you. I didn't know, Victor whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know about your mother. If you'd told me, if I'd known. I tried to tell you, I said, and now my voice was colder. You didn't want to hear it. You wanted to believe I was lazy because it was easier than asking questions, easier than seeing a young human being with a life outside the classroom, easier than showing compassion. Francesco was crying now. Seth looked confused and upset, like his whole world had just shifted in a way he didn't understand. I saved your son's life because that's my job, I said, looking directly at Victor. I took an oath to do no harm, to help my patients to the best of my ability. Seth is my patient. I gave him the same care I'd give anyone because he deserves it. He's a good kid, and he didn't do anything wrong. I let that hang in the air for a moment. But I want you to understand something, Mr. Granger. I did my duty. I did what I was trained to do. I did it well. I paused, met his eyes. But I do not forgive you. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. I hope Seth makes a full recovery, I said. He's a good kid, and he deserves a full life. But I won't be seeing your family for follow-up appointments. I'm transferring his care to my colleague, Dr. Wesley Dunbar. He's excellent. Seth will be in good hands. I set down the glass of water I'd been holding. Nobody had moved. Nobody had said anything. Thank you for the invitation, I said. I'll show myself out. I walked to the door, through the silent house, out into the October afternoon. I got in my car, drove home, went to my apartment, sat on my couch, and stared at the wall for 2 hours. I thought about my mother, wondered if this was what she would have wanted, this cold revenge, this public shaming of an old man. I didn't think so. She'd been kind. She'd believed in forgiveness, in second chances, in being better than your worst moments. But she was dead, and I was alive, and I'd carried that anger for 17 years. And now I'd finally released it. It didn't feel like I'd thought it would. I'd imagined vindication, triumph, a sense of justice finally being served. Instead, I just felt empty. The same emptiness I'd felt for years, just with a new, hollow space where the anger used to be. I heard through the hospital grapevine what happened next. Word travels fast in medical communities, and the story of a neurosurgeon publicly confronting his former teacher at a patient celebration was too good not to spread. Victor Granger had a heart attack 3 days after the gathering. He was hospitalized for a week, treated for acute coronary syndrome. He was discharged with medications and instructions for cardiac rehab. He died 2 months later, December 19th. Another heart attack, this one fatal. The obituary said he was survived by his wife, Francesca, and his son, Seth. It said he'd been a beloved teacher at Riverside Middle School for 43 years, that he'd touched countless lives, that he'd be remembered for his dedication to education. It didn't mention me, But everyone who'd been at that gathering knew. Victor Granger had died of guilt, of shame, of the sudden knowledge that he'd been cruel to a child who was suffering. The stress had killed him, as surely as if I'd put a knife in his chest. I'd saved one life and ended another. The math didn't work out to zero. Seth recovered better than anyone expected. The radiation and chemotherapy worked. His MRI scans showed no tumor recurrence. 5 years after surgery, he was cancer-free. I followed his case from a distance, through medical records I shouldn't have accessed but did. He graduated high school with honors. He went to college, Boston College, ironically, not far from where I worked. He studied psychology, apparently wanting to help other kids who've been through trauma. He lived. Because of me, he lived. And his father died. Because of me, his father died. I tried not to think about it too much. I had other patients, other surgeries, other lives to save. I couldn't dwell on one case, one family, one moment of revenge that had spiraled into something I hadn't quite anticipated. But I thought about it anyway. I'm 45 now. I'm still a neurosurgeon at Boston Presbyterian, still one of the best. My success rate is up to 96%. I've trained residents who've gone on to run their own programs. I've published over 40 papers. I have a textbook on pediatric neurosurgery that's used in medical schools across the country. I live in a nice house in Brookline now, 3 bedrooms, a yard, a garage. I bought it 2 years ago when I finally had enough saved for a down payment. I have a girlfriend, Priscilla Talley, funny enough. She's the daughter of April Talley, the social worker who tried to help me at the hospital when my mother was dying. Small world. Priscilla is a hospital administrator, kind and patient and willing to accept that I'm emotionally unavailable in ways I can't quite explain or fix. We've been together for 3 years. She wants to get married. I keep saying maybe, not yet, soon. She deserves better than maybe, but she stays anyway. I have money, I have respect. I have everything I set out to achieve when I was 15 years old and drowning in grief and rage. And I'm still alone. Not physically. Priscilla is here, colleagues are here, patients are here. But the part of me that could connect to people, that could be vulnerable, that could trust, that died somewhere between 8th grade and now. Maybe it died with my mother. Maybe it died when Mr. Granger taught me that the world doesn't care about your pain, that showing weakness is an invitation to be hurt, that you're on your own. Or maybe I killed it myself, deliberately, because it was easier to be cold than to keep feeling everything. I think about that gathering sometimes, replay it in my mind, wonder if I could have handled it differently. Wonder if I should have just transferred Seth's case from the beginning, never said anything, let Victor Granger live out his remaining years in ignorance of what he'd done. But then I think about 14-year-old Nolan, falling asleep in class because he'd been watching his mother die. I think about how nobody helped him, how nobody saw him, how the adults who were supposed to protect him just punished him instead. And I think that boy deserved vindication. He deserved someone to stand up for him, to say that what happened was wrong, that he wasn't lazy or a disgrace, that he was just a kid trying to survive something impossible. So I stood up for him. 17 years too late, I stood up for him. And it destroyed an old man who might have changed in the decades since he taught 8th grade, who might have learned compassion, who might have become a better person. I'll never know. I didn't want to know. I wanted him to understand what he'd done, and I wanted him to carry that weight. He carried it for 3 months, then it killed him. I don't regret it. I should, maybe. A man is dead, at least partially because of what I said. A man who was someone's husband, someone's father. a man who'd spent 43 years teaching, who'd probably helped some students even if he'd hurt others. But I don't regret it. I just wish it had felt different. I wish the vindication had been triumphant, healing, cathartic. Instead, it was just cold and hollow, one more scar on top of all the others. My mother used to say that pain makes you stronger. She was wrong. Pain just makes you harder. It builds walls that keep the world out, but it also keeps you in, trapped inside your own defenses. I'm the best neurosurgeon I know. I can navigate the human brain with millimeter precision. I can make decisions in seconds that determine whether someone lives or dies. I can do things that most people can't even comprehend. But I can't forgive. I can't let go. I can't be anything other than what I built myself to be: successful, competent, and completely untouchable. Mr. Granger taught me that the world doesn't care about your excuses. He was right. The world doesn't care. It just keeps turning, indifferent to your pain, indifferent to your triumph, indifferent to everything except results. I got results. I won. I proved everyone wrong, and it changed me permanently. Not in the way winning is supposed to change you. It didn't make me happier or more confident or more fulfilled. It just made me colder, more isolated, more certain that the only person you can rely on is yourself, and even that's not always enough. Priscilla asked me last week why I never talk about my childhood. I told her there's nothing to talk about. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. What would I tell her? That I watched my mother die and nobody helped? That a teacher crushed me when I was at my lowest and I waited 17 years to make him pay? That I've built my entire life around proving I'm not the lazy, worthless kid I was told I was? That I won, but winning didn't fix anything? She wouldn't understand. Nobody would. You can't understand this kind of damage unless you've lived it. So I keep it to myself. I keep everything to myself. I'm successful and respected and fundamentally alone. And that's how it has to be. Because the world doesn't care about your excuses. Mr. Granger taught me that. And I taught him that lessons once learned are never forgotten, even when you wish they could be. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.